Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Wellness Coach, the Wellness Podcast, and My Daily Well. My name is Edie Summers, and my very special guest today is Dr. Evan Hirsch. He is an energy expert, and we're going to be talking about how to resolve long COVID and chronic fatigue naturally. So stay tuned because we're going to go through a very specific 4-step process. But first, Dr. Hirsch, if you could share just maybe a little bit of your backstory, because I know that you had chronic fatigue. Is that right? And also your wife?
I did, Edie, and thanks so much for having me on. And you can call me Evan. I no
Okay.
longer operate as a doctor. I'm now a health coach online, so it's nice to kind of leave that in the past, even though I still
Yeah.
have my MD. Yeah.
And just as a side note, so many doctors are making that transition to coaching or in addition, because I know it's such an important field. So
Yeah, it's true. So my story really started when I met my wife and we fell in love. This was 2004, and 3 months later she couldn't get out of bed. And that lasted for the better part of 3 years. And she had chronic fatigue syndrome. I was doing my residency at that time in family medicine through the University of Washington. And I was asking all of my attendings and other doctors that I was surrounded by, and they really didn't have any idea about how to help somebody with chronic fatigue beyond, is it cardiovascular? Is it a heart issue? Is it a lung issue? Is it a thyroid issue? Is it B12? Besides that, they really didn't have any answers. And so that was my first exposure, and it was really heartbreaking because here I am, kind of at the pinnacle of my educational career, and this person who I'm falling in love with, and I can't help her. So that was really challenging. And so after that, after she got mostly better, we ended up marrying, and we had a child, and I started my own practice. I came out of residency in 2007 and immediately started a functional medicine practice, functional family medicine combo. And
Awesome.
then a couple years after that, in 2010, my energy just really never recovered after residency. And I got chronic fatigue syndrome at that point. And I was napping underneath my desk during the day. I had 4,000 square feet of office space and 10 employees, and I had to keep hiring people to do my job because I had brain fog, I had body pain, I had really bad fatigue, and I could barely keep my eyes open during the day. And when I went home, my wife is like, "Hey, can you help out with the dishes?" And I couldn't. And we had this new child, and she's like, "Daddy, play with me." And I couldn't do that either. And it was just heartbreaking, and I felt like my life was exploding. And finally, after napping underneath my desk for what felt like the millionth day in a row, I realized, okay, I know that I have to prioritize myself. I was already gluten-free, dairy-free. I had done a yoga teacher training back in 2004 at Kripalu. I had done acupuncture training. I had all this knowledge, and I knew I had to just start prioritizing myself and my health. And I started replacing my deficiencies like I learned in functional medicine, but I still couldn't get better. I kind of plateaued after, getting my energy up just a little bit. And so I had to go on this search, and I went into environmental medicine and learned about heavy metals and chemicals and molds and infections, including Lyme disease. And then several years after that, I learned more about the nervous system retraining. And so once I started applying that to my life, I started getting better one at a time as I addressed these underlying causes, now what I call the toxic five that we can get into. And then I wrote a book about it, and it really became my mission to help people with chronic fatigue syndrome get better. And then we were uniquely positioned for long COVID because long COVID is essentially chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis, but with a different name and a different trigger.
Right, exactly. And what is the name of your book, by the way?
It's called Fix Your Fatigue.
Fix Your Fatigue. That's a great title. And you probably know this too, that I also had an experience with this, and I also wrote a book on this. But it's such an important topic, and there aren't enough people talking about it. And chronic fatigue syndrome got more publicity, for lack of a better term, once long COVID surfaced. And so
Right.
in some ways that was a blessing. But so let's get into it. So for everyone who's listening, whether it's live or for the replay, because again, these are really important topics. So if you could explain what long COVID is, and then also how does someone know if they have it? Let's start there.
So long COVID is persistent symptoms or symptoms that persist after you have exposure to the spike protein.
Okay.
And so consequently, the typical picture is that since 2020, if you had a viral illness, whether it was diagnosed as COVID or not, since the testing really isn't great, and then subsequently you had some sort of new symptom or weird symptom, then it's highly likely that you have long COVID. There is testing available, but it's really not great. It looks at your immune system's reaction to spike protein in the body. But unfortunately, if your immune system is not functioning well, you don't get an accurate read on that test.
Okay. So it has to do with the spike protein. So I just want to make sure I understand. So it's specifically related to that. Is it that it doesn't leave, kind of lingers in the body and then creates those symptoms? Is that what it's doing, or?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
So the spike protein gets into the cells, and depending on where it gets into in the body determines where your symptoms are. So there can be over 250 different symptoms associated with long COVID, unfortunately. And so for some people, if it gets into the nervous system, you can get lost of smell and taste. You can get brain fog. You can get numbness and tingling in the hands and feet. If it gets into the muscles, you can get muscle cramps, muscle pain. If it gets into the bladder, you can have urinary tract issues. If it gets into the gut, you can have diarrhea. So it really runs the gamut. And it doesn't really have to come directly after you get the virus. Sometimes that's the case. But sometimes you're fine for a couple of weeks to a couple of months after you get the virus. And then all of a sudden it comes back. It just really depends on the stressors that you have in your life, how your immune system is functioning, and then whether or not you have the toxic 5. When you have toxins and infections in your body, they're going to distract the immune system. And that sets the stage for being able to get this chronic condition.
And then, so very interesting. And we're going to get into the toxic 5. So would it also be considered like a retrovirus then? If it's, because I also know with maybe some of these, I know we're going to be talking about viruses as well, but is it something that maybe lays low? And then again, depending on different factors, might stimulate it, like too much stress or toxins, like other situations. Is that maybe what sets it off or kind of wakes it up?
Yeah, yes to the latter, no to the former. So it's not really classified as a retrovirus because that's like a particular classification based on how a virus is functioning. But it does have that latent appearance where, it gets into the body, it takes up shop, and then it kind of waits for an opportunity to be opportunistic.
Very interesting. And I just want to say, from the community that I work with just online and on social media, a lot of people will say, like, I've definitely posted about long COVID, just sharing that it is, there's some crossover and people can develop chronic fatigue syndrome from it. But I've definitely noticed that some people say, oh, they're not the same, we're not in the same category. But it sounds very much like there's a lot of similarity.
Well, yeah, and I think it's really, and I would imagine it's probably the chronic fatigue people who are saying that because they are fiercely protective over the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, which I find very interesting because I also have conversations with them. But chronic fatigue syndrome is a diagnosis, or myalgic encephalitis or myalgic encephalomyelitis. Those are diagnoses. And in the United States, chronic fatigue syndrome is diagnosed since 2015 by the Institute of Medicine by having really significant exhaustion, post-exertional malaise, where you exert yourself and you feel worse, brain fog, body pain, and sleep issues. And you have to have all of those for longer than 6 months.
Right.
So, my situation when I had chronic fatigue syndrome, and I call it that, even though I wasn't diagnosable, like I did not have sleep issues. I had everything else, but I didn't have sleep issues. So, the hill that I'm going to die on is that just because you haven't been diagnosed with an official diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome doesn't mean that you don't have chronic fatigue plus these other symptoms, and it doesn't mean that you don't need help,
Right.
right? Because if you
Exactly.
have symptoms like chronic fatigue and these other ones that are significantly compromising the quality of your life, you need help. And long COVID, you can have like over these 250 different symptoms. Oh yeah, and part of the diagnosis for long COVID or post-acute sequelae to SARS-CoV-2, PASC, is that you have to
Wow.
have those, right, it's a mouthful. You have to have those symptoms for longer than 2
Wow.
months.
Okay. And what was that last one? What did Dr. Evan, what is that last one again? What is that related to? Is it a symptom or that was a long classification there? What?
Sorry, so
I'm just curious.
the official term for long COVID is
Oh,
post-acute sequelae to SARS-CoV-2.
wow.
And so sequelae means consequence. So it's
Okay. Interesting.
post-acute. Yeah. So
So
it
interesting.
basically just means long COVID. It's just easier to say
Wow.
that. But if you see
Yeah.
PASC,
Hmm.
that is just what the official diagnosis would be, even though it's still kind of like, is it 2 months? Like, do you have to have it for 2 months? Do you have to have it
Yeah.
for 3 months? These are still kind of debates that are happening. But,
Hmm.
I kind of go with 2 months, but most of the people that I see have been suffering for a year or longer,
Yeah.
and they're just ready to resolve their symptoms.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I'm seeing even like, I think Chris Cuomo had it. Like I've seen like, people talking about it in the media too. And I would just say that anyone who has chronic fatigue for any reason, this is the place for you to be and listen and to find help.
Mhm.
So how big is how big of a public health problem is long COVID? And why is it so hard to treat? You may have already addressed some of that to some degree.
Yeah, so when you look at the stats, there's somewhere between 20 and 40% of everybody who gets COVID ends up with some persistent symptom of COVID.
Wow, it's
Yeah,
huge.
exactly. And so if you think, there's 8 billion people on the planet, and the majority of those people have already had COVID probably,
Mhm.
you're looking at a billion person problem. And it's already, I think the stats I was looking at the other day, it's costing the government in the US already $1 trillion with the amount of disability and lost work time, $1 trillion. And,
Wow.
so it's a really significant issue. And beyond that, beyond the money and the stats, there's obviously the lost lives, that people are having. I was just on a call the other day with an individual who just keeps getting worse, and he's been ill for almost 5 years, and his mother-in-law just mentioned, hey, I wonder if you have long COVID. And all of a sudden he starts
Mm,
researching it, and he's like, oh my goodness, this is my problem. And
there you go. Yeah.
it's
Right.
having that awareness. And
Okay.
these people who, I mean, he can't go hiking like so many people in my program, like used to
Yeah.
be athletes. I had somebody just reach out to me who used to be a professional boxer in Europe
Wow.
and
Mhm.
now is bedridden, and so
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah.
it's just really tragic.
It is. And this is a side question, but if you have, let's say, long COVID and or chronic fatigue syndrome, can they exacerbate one another? Do you happen to know, like, would it make one worse if you had the other one?
Absolutely, yeah. So when you have the toxic five, which
Yeah.
are these toxins and infections that build up in your body over the course of your life, it ends
Hmm.
up compromising the integrity and the function of your immune system and of your
Okay.
nervous system,
Okay.
among other systems in the body. Your hormones get deficient, your vitamins and your minerals, etc. And any subsequent stressor is going to make things worse or push you back into a crash.
Hmm.
And so that's definitely what we're seeing, is that, the people who get long COVID, they've got the toxic five in their body. And almost always they say, I had an inkling, I was already having some kind of symptoms before I end up getting long COVID. Then maybe they'll say, I had some
Hmm.
autoimmunity, I had a little bit of fatigue, maybe I had some muscle pain. I was already starting to have some symptoms that I was seeing a doctor about, I was thinking about seeing a doctor about, and all of a sudden I get hit with long COVID. So
Hmm.
absolutely, it's part of the same sort of process where the body
Hmm.
can't function correctly when these toxins and infections and nervous system dysfunction are present.
And it makes sense. So then before we address the toxic five in depth, could you explain what the four-step Energy MD method is, and how would you use that to resolve long COVID and chronic fatigue?
Yeah, so this is the process that we take people through. The first step is to determine what causes an individual has. So for all the people with chronic fatigue syndrome that I've seen over the last decade, I have found that they all have the toxic five: the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, and the nervous system dysfunction that has built up in their body over time, caused compromise to the mitochondria, which produces our energy, decreases our hormones, vitamins, minerals, etc., which ends up causing the symptoms. And so we're always going to treat the toxic five in our program. And then just about everybody has chronic fatigue. There are people who have long COVID who don't have fatigue. But for everybody who has fatigue, we also address adrenal function and
Okay.
mitochondrial function, since they play a central role in producing energy. And so we're always going to treat those. And we're looking at 30 plus different causes in our program to make sure we leave no stone unturned. But then the question is, like, do you have thyroid issues? Do you have constipation? Do you have mindset issues? What are your lifestyle habits? What's your vitamin D and your B12? So we do look at those as well to kind of tailor something individually for an individual. But the big picture is, we want to make sure that when they're done with our program, we have addressed 99% of all of their potential causes, because this is how we know that we're going to get to the finish line. Now, unfortunately, doing this work for the last decade, I have found that labs are inherently imperfect. So when you're doing like a urine test to look at like heavy metals and chemicals and molds, it's directly dependent on your ability to detoxify.
Right. I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
So if you do not detoxify well, then your laboratory testing is not going to show up. And if you don't show up as being positive for one of these toxins, nobody's going to treat you, because they're relying on the laboratory test. And so I see a lot of people who are like, I've tested normal, and then we go ahead and take them through the process, and inevitably they've got that toxin that's coming out of their body. So that's the first step, is to make sure that we're leaving no stone unturned and addressing everything and personalizing the causes to that person's specific condition. Then the second step in the four-step process is to start by replacing the deficiencies. So spoiler alert, this process is all about removing the toxic five, but we don't do that until step 4, because we have to set the stage and we have to support the body appropriately. So when you start replacing deficiencies like in adrenals and thyroid and sex hormones, mitochondria, vitamins, minerals, lifestyle habits, mindset, everything just ends up working better in the body. You get a small uptick in your energy, you have less crashes, your mood is better, you're able to prepare your meals, you're able to potentially work your job a little bit better, you're less stressed by life. So all of those things are going to be supportive for moving through the process. Oh, and then also you're more easily able to deal with die-off, which can happen, or Alzheimer's reaction, when you're starting to remove the toxins and infections in step 4. So that's step 2. Any questions on that before I go to step 3?
Well, I just want to say that I've definitely experienced that myself and read that in the research, that you always want to support your body first, kind of build up your resilience. Yeah. And just so that, because you never want to detoxify first, because that can, if you're already kind of depleted, that's going to stress your body out even more, I would say.
So. And that's exactly right. Yes. And what your body cannot tolerate right now is stress. And all of the toxic five, whether it's a physical stressor, a mental, emotional, spiritual, whatever, those are all, you got put in this position by stressors, things that are stressing out the body, the human experience, in your case, that the body's not able to tolerate. And it comes to a point where it's like, hey, I just need to lie down, rest, and relax. I know you talk a lot about this, listening to your body, right?
You've been listening.
So,
maybe say it too much, maybe too much, but it is important. It's important.
It's so important, and that happens when the body is like stressed out. Part of this is what's called the cell danger response, where the body's like, I need to rest and relax right now because I'm overwhelmed by all the stress and all the toxins and infections that are happening in my body right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And before you go to the last two parts, I want to say that in my experience, I was also diagnosed with like a liver disorder. So I don't detoxify well. I don't methylate. I am like a poor methylator, for lack of a better
Mhm.
term. So I don't know if that's something that you've found along the way. Maybe that's part of the toxin conversation. Just I found in research a lot of people don't detoxify well that develop chronic conditions. But
Absolutely.
wondering what
Yep,
you thought.
and yeah, I definitely found that too.
Yeah,
The majority of people in our programs do not methylate well.
yeah,
And, the more toxins and infections you have, the more quote unquote clogged your detoxification pathways are
yeah.
anyway. But we don't use methylated vitamins in our program
Mm,
because most
yeah,
people can't tolerate them because of
interesting.
yeah, because when you start methylating, you start detoxifying way too quickly. And so
Mm,
you have to go through a process first before you actually, we'll use non-methylated B vitamins,
yeah.
but you have to go through a process of removing a lot of these toxins and infections before anybody can tolerate any sort of methylated B vitamin.
That is so interesting. I'm so glad you said that because I think that's thrown around a lot. Just kind of use these methylated vitamins and
Right.
that might solve your problem. And yeah. So and
Right.
then what are the last two parts of
So the
your
last so
program?
step 3 is opening up the exit pathways.
Mm,
So kind of like what we were talking about, the
yeah.
liver, the kidney, the lymph, the neural lymph, the gallbladder, the intestines. These are all ways that we get toxins out of the body in addition to the skin and our breath that
Mhm,
are so important to be open in order to go into step 4 and start pulling out the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections. They
mm,
have to have a place to go.
mm,
Otherwise, they'll
yeah.
just get recirculated back into the body. So I kind of like to think of this as a funnel where
Mhm,
you're dumping these toxins and infections into the funnel, and then how patent or open the bottom part of the funnel is directly
mhm,
related to your ability to detoxify. And we
yeah.
always want to
Makes sense.
detoxify people at a rate that their body can tolerate. So we
Mhm,
want the amount in to this funnel to be equal to the amount that's going out so that you
mhm.
don't get an overflow that then goes back into the rest of your body.
That makes a lot of sense. That sounds very holistic. And the other thing I want to say is that the other thing is that it sounds like you really personalize your program, which is what people
Mhm.
need. And I love that holistic approach because that's every person's different, right? They're going to have different factors. So,
And
yeah.
personalization is really interesting because a lot of people think that it's like their initial plan is personalized, which it is. But what's
Mhm.
even more important is your reaction to treatment and how
Interesting.
that gets personalized. We
Yeah.
guarantee a response to any question people have in 2 business days because when you have an issue, when you hit a bump, when you feel worse, you have to be able to get an answer so that you can
Yeah.
pivot because,
Right.
we'll give people a plan, for the next 6 months or so or the next 12 months when they join the program, but the
Yeah.
reality is that they're going to pivot about 50 times
Yeah.
because they're an individual and they've got different genetic SNPs and
Yeah.
different experiences and different toxins and infections in their body. And it has to be personalized.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because, part of it is that like paying attention to the signals from your body, right? Like what is your body asking of you? And then conferring with, your practitioner, like, hey, how can we pivot here to make the best next guess and step here. So I love
Absolutely.
that. And then did you already address the fourth part, Dr. Hirsch, or that was the
Well, I
fourth?
said, yeah, the
Yeah.
toxic 5. And so that's removing the heavy metals and the
Yeah.
chemicals and the molds and the infections and the nervous system dysfunction, which I know you talk about as well. But
Right.
that's been really a game changer is
Yeah.
we created a nervous system retraining program in our
Mm.
program about 6 months ago.
Mhm.
And,
Awesome.
because I saw how many people were getting better by doing the nervous system retraining. And
Yes.
it's so essential.
Absolutely. And then, so then how would you test for the toxic 5 in your
So I
program?
don't. I actually don't
Oh,
test for it, given the fact that over the
interesting.
last decade, I found that everybody has it, and that I'd
Mm,
rather you spend your time, energy, and money just treating it. You actually get
mhm,
better faster when you do
mm,
that, and you leave no stone unturned. So if labs are
mm,
imperfect,
mhm.
then and you miss something, then you're not going to address something, and potentially that's going to be a hole in your treatment. And if you're spending your time, energy, and money on laboratory tests, which are also, there's a delay between, okay, so you get the test done, and then it comes back. Well, first off, you get the box, which you take home, and then you forget to do for a couple of months, right? I
Or
mean,
it's just stressful. Yeah.
exactly. You've got brain fog, you've got
Yeah.
fatigue, and then you go ahead and you get that lab done. Let's say we're talking about heavy metals, and
Yeah.
you send it in. It takes 4 weeks to get back, and then you get put
Mhm.
on a protocol, and then you do
Mhm.
that protocol for 3 months, and then you repeat that test again, which you've lost somewhere in your home, and then you get it back, and then you do that test. Takes a month to get back, and then you
Mhm.
see like whether or not you've actually done well. Oh, and by the way,
Mhm.
the chelating product that you're taking can only chelate certain metals, and so it's not going to tell you whether or not all metals are being addressed as part of this process. So
Mhm.
I've just found that it's I've been burned enough by these laboratory tests that
Mhm.
I've found that it's just better to address all the heavy metals, all the chemicals, all the molds and mycotoxins, all the different infections, including Lyme and parasites, in
Mhm.
order to be able to get people to the finish line, because it's not
Mhm.
more expensive. It takes less time. And we use tinctures. Everything we do
Mm.
is
Mhm.
natural, and the majority of what we're using is herbal. And just
Mhm.
ramping up by a tincture, by a drop
Mhm.
at a time,
That
is
makes
going to
sense
tell
too.
me which cause you have. Because if you're
Yeah.
reacting to a tincture that's pulling out heavy metals and chemicals and you feel worse, I know that you have heavy metals and chemicals, right? And so
Right.
I don't need that test, which is may or may not tell me that you have it, and then we miss that cause, and then we're sitting scratching our heads at 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, being like, gosh, I don't know why you're not better. And now
Yeah.
we're getting better. We're getting people better so much more quickly.
That's awesome. And also I like the microdosing approach too, because again, people are so sensitive, but it is also a great way to kind of test the waters too. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. And then and you were also talking about can you talk a little bit more about your nervous system, that program? Because yes, I think that's a huge part of it. And I mean, in my experience, I found that my nervous system kind of found a new normal, which I talk about. That normal goes up and down a little bit, and I have been able to get it almost all the way back to 100%. But the problem is that it's kind of it's like a different sensitivity than it used to be in my
Mhm.
nervous system. And I think that it's such a huge component for so many people for so many different reasons, even beyond these two topics. But I would love to know a little bit more about that if you have time.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience, I'm a singer, and
Oh,
I
wow,
I
awesome.
competitively sing, singing musical theater.
Oh,
I
wow.
couldn't get on stage when I had my
Mhm.
chronic fatigue because
Mhm.
my nervous system was so jacked. I couldn't do
Mhm.
interviews like this,
Mhm.
because my nervous system would just kind of take off. And
Mhm.
so it became a really important part of my journey. And I saw so many people getting better. What they just got better faster when they're doing the nervous system retraining. So we look
Mhm.
at it from a top down and a bottom up approach. So the top down approach is working on your thoughts, so your
Yeah.
mindset.
Mhm.
We have a 4-step practice where, there's gratitudes, there's
Mhm.
envisioning your ideal day, your ideal life, your ideal health.
Mhm.
There's affirmations, or flipping your disempowering beliefs into empowering beliefs. And then there's asking yourself empowering questions. Instead of
Mhm.
asking yourself, why is this
Mhm.
happening to me? Which
Yeah.
gives you an answer that doesn't really serve you. You can ask yourself, how can I love myself more today?
Mhm.
Right? So it
Yeah.
really changes the way you see the world. It
Mhm.
allows you, part of our nervous system dysfunction not only comes from the toxic four, the
Mhm.
actual physical toxins and infections, but
Yeah.
also from the trauma that we've
Right.
experienced. And, at
Right.
some point in our lives, we looked at the world and we said the world was not safe. And our
Yeah.
nervous system took that into account and consequently ended up changing the way that it was working in order to, quote unquote, do everything it possibly could to keep us safe. And so we have
Right.
to remind ourselves that we are safe, we are
Mhm.
loved, we are enough. And when we truly believe that, amazing things happen.
I love that, and I really do believe that. What I've learned and seen in the research too is that um, positive, memorable new experiences that include other people, you can kind of rebuild that safety and trust too, and kind of
Mhm.
coax your nervous system back more toward a normal functioning state. But yeah, that's thank you for adding that in because I think that so many people need that. And so it's, I mean, and it feels so much better when your nervous system is more balanced. And then, so how do you know if you can help someone or not, would you say?
So let me just touch on the bottom up at first, and
Oh,
then we'll kind of go into that. Is
absolutely.
that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. Take your time.
So the bottom up perspective is changing your body, your physical body,
Mhm.
by doing breath work, by
Yeah.
humming, by gargling, all
Yeah.
of these things in order to change your nervous system. So that was
Mhm.
just a quick add-on to there's the
Oh,
top down, and then there's the bottom
absolutely.
up. And we have a
Oh,
basic
yeah.
version and then a more advanced version. And if people want to go deeper, they can join a standalone limbic system amygdala retraining program like the Gupta program,
Mhm.
or Primal Trust, or DNRS, or stuff like that. But we found
Mhm.
it's better for people who are going through our program to have it included, so they don't have to
Yeah.
have another learning curve, and then they can go deeper if they want.
Absolutely. And I'll just add on to that, Evan, that I think this is a very big part of it because your nervous system is one of the oldest systems in your body, right? And it, of course, is connected to your immune system. And if your nervous system feels calmer, that might send signals. Let's say if it's related to the cell danger response, right? If your mitochondria aren't kind of on alert, if I'm understanding it correctly, they might maybe calm down more and maybe go more back to producing energy, for instance. So and I've definitely found that, doesn't it also impact when you're working on from the bottom up, you're kind of working on your vagal tone over tone, right?
Exactly.
That kind
Yep.
of improving the way that your nervous system kind of communicates with other parts of your brain. And I know these are big topics too, I know.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the vagus nerve is incredibly important. It runs from the brain down
Mhm,
through the back of the throat, through the
mhm.
diaphragm, and out to all the organs. And it really is, it's this balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. To keep it simple, the
Mhm,
sympathetic is like fight, flight, or freeze.
mhm.
When you're in a stressful situation, the parasympathetic is rest, digest, and healing. And we really want to be, when you're not well, you're in sympathetic, and we really want to put you into the
Right.
parasympathetic. And so
Mm.
that's really what this does. Taking deep breaths, and some of these things that we've heard about for years, but now if you formally do it,
Yeah,
doing some breath holds, doing that humming, doing that gargling, can make a really big difference in people's lives.
absolutely. And I love how you say that when you're sick, you're in the sympathetic response. You're almost kind of stuck in that
Mm.
response. So yeah. And then the goal is to be more instead of being in the stress response all the time or more of the time, the humming or the breath work, it helps your body get into the relaxation response, right? Which is kind of like the opposite of that. And that sometimes
Yeah.
can feel foreign if we haven't been there for a while.
Exactly, and in today's society, it's really hard to be in there. You have to be very conscious about making sure that you have time for that. And it doesn't have to be formal meditation, though that can definitely help. But it
Mhm.
is taking that time, downtime, being quiet, not being on your phone, not listening to the news, like not, like you have to really prioritize that time, because you can just go, go, go all day long.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of our challenges in this modern world in general is for all of us, whether we're feeling good or not, just to have more downtime and intentional offline time and downtime and enjoy the world more and look around more and calm down more and for our own well-being. And again, these are big topics. But again, kind of circling back to that question, how would you know if you could? How do you know if you can help someone based on your expertise and program?
Yeah, so when I get on calls with people to see whether or not we're a good fit to work together, I'm looking at a couple of things. So one
Yeah.
is I want to see if they've addressed all of the toxic five fully. Because
Mhm.
the reality is that I've never met anybody who has addressed all of the toxic five fully and hasn't gotten better.
Mhm. Hmm.
And so if they have, and they've addressed the toxic five fully, and then I'm kind of scratching my head, I'm like, I don't have anything else to offer you. But
Mhm. Yeah.
inevitably, 10 times out of 10, I've actually never gotten on a call where somebody has actually done that. So if you're
Mhm.
still having your symptoms and you feel like you've done everything, the reality is that you probably haven't.
Mhm. Okay.
Either you haven't addressed all the causes, or you haven't addressed them to completion.
Mhm.
So that's
Right.
the first thing that I look at.
Okay.
And then the second thing has a lot to do with personality characteristics and willingness to do the work. So,
Mhm.
is somebody willing to work on their mental and emotional health? I was
Mhm.
on the call the other day with somebody who's like, you know what, I think that's, the nervous system retraining stuff kind of is woohoo, or whatever
Mm.
you called it,
Mhm.
Um, and I said, well, then our program's not for you.
Mhm.
Like, this is something that I've seen works. And if you're not willing to do what I've seen works, I can't, get you to the finish line. I want to make sure that whoever I work with is going to be able to get to the finish line, so I want to
Mhm.
make sure they're going to implement. There are still people who like have joined my program in the past who, they're going to spend a lot of money on a program and yet they don't
Mhm.
implement. It's
Mhm.
like you
Right.
have to be willing and able to reach out to me when you get stuck, when you have a question. Don't worry about bothering me. This
Mhm.
is, like if you're worried about bothering me, then our program probably isn't for you, because
Mhm.
you have to reach out, because I'm not at home with you. I don't know what you're doing on a regular basis. So you
Right.
have to implement, you have to follow instructions. Those are the people who I know are going to be successful when they work through a program. And unfortunately, if your brain fog is really bad and you
Mhm.
can't work through a process, it's going to be really hard to get better with our program. So that's another
Mhm.
question that I ask. So if
Mhm.
somebody says they have really bad brain fog, I say,
Mhm.
unfortunately, I don't think that our program is for you. So,
Mhm. That
go
makes
see a local provider, try to do things, more kind of like hand holding, but going through a process of addressing all of the causes. Even though
Mhm.
we provide daily, like almost daily, almost weekly, monthly support, in a
Yeah.
number of different ways, like
Yeah.
it still is different than, having somebody like in your space with you in order to hold your hand and make sure that things are happening. And oftentimes people with
Right.
really bad brain fog, they need somebody else to kind of like help them through a process. So
Right. That makes
that's how
sense.
we do our
Yeah.
due diligence.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, and everyone needs different levels of support. And I would have to say that one of the main things that helped me was an intention that I set, which kind of sounds like a similar, almost like an agreement, right? It was an agreement with myself to find whatever, to do whatever I had to do or could do to feel better. So my story was, I first hurt my knee and then had surgery, and then after that I developed chronic fatigue. And then so first I wanted to resolve my knee issue and get my scar tissue down, and then I developed chronic fatigue. And so then it was both situations. It was making an intention. And so it sounds like it's kind of a similar thing. Like if you're working with someone else, you're making an agreement, and then,
Right.
yeah, it's a way of programming your mind for the follow through part. So yeah, and
Exactly. And it's,
yeah,
like, and the recipe really is like, if you're addressing all of the possible causes
yeah,
and you're using treatments that are going to work, the
hmm,
next step really is having amazing support, having accountability,
yeah,
but
right,
you have to step into that and say, okay, I'm going to do everything that I can in order to be able to get better, you
hmm,
know, and so it is that partnership that needs to happen. And that's what people
yeah,
say that they're looking for when they're talking about, like, I want to work with somebody. They're looking for a partnership, but sometimes they're not willing to necessarily step into that and be like, okay, I'm going to implement, and when I have questions, I'm going to reach out.
yeah, absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And then also, could you share with us a story of a typical experience of someone who has been in your program?
Yeah, so this is actually top of mind because it just happened yesterday. So let's call him Tom. He lives in Australia, and he came to us 6 months ago with headaches, dizziness, really bad fatigue, heart palpitations, and digestive issues.
Mhm.
And now he's 6 months into the program. We just had a 6 month check in, and he's 80% better in all of his symptoms. His energy went from a 6 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10.
Awesome.
He's on all of the supplements, so he's addressing everything in step 4, all the toxic 5. He's doing his nervous system retraining. This usually doesn't happen until around month 9. So
Mm,
the
mhm,
fact, I mean, he was fortunate enough where he was able to introduce all of the tinctures. We introduce them one drop at a time sort of thing, one tincture at a time to make sure that we know what's happening. He
Yeah.
reached out when he had questions. There were definitely pivots that needed to happen when he felt worse. We increased his die-off support in step 3 and then pivoted back into step 4 and ramped up maybe a little bit more slowly when it came to certain tinctures and certain causes that we were addressing. But typically, like I said, this happens around month 9 or month 10, where the lights come on, everything starts working better when you've removed an appreciable amount of the toxic 5. And so my conversation with him yesterday was like, let's get you to the finish line. He's committed for another 6 months. Generally we see people at 12 months or generally between 60 and 100% better. And if they're not 100%, then it's usually they'll need another 6 months or so. So, it's it's a process that works really well. I feel really blessed that we have so many testimonials on our website attesting to the success of the program. But so much is just what I've learned and what I've cultivated. And I'm just a vehicle, a simple man, an imperfect man. And I just kind of put this together based on what I've learned and what I've seen.
I think that's amazing. And so many people need help, and there aren't enough practitioners out there helping, because not a lot of practitioners have been through it and or really understand it. So, and I just want to say that when you mention kind of the lights go on, I talk about that too, kind of like the lights of health. It's, it is definitely a feeling that you get after a certain point of, whether you're working with someone or, kind of figuring out like how your body's communicating with you and adjusting based on that, or a combination of the two, which is often what it is. So Evan, how would someone connect with you or get started with you if they wanted to?
So if you want to see if your fatigue is fixable, you can check out my latest quiz. I call it the Is Your Fatigue Fixable quiz or assessment. It's at myfatiguescore.com, and you'll get a score based on where you're at. And then there'll be some additional information. You can watch my latest masterclass where I go deeper into my philosophy of care, and then you can get on a free call with me to see if we're a good fit to work together.
Perfect. And then I really like that. And then also very quickly, I know that you did mention the toxic 5, but let's go. Can you just spell those out again, just so they're crystal clear for people? And then any final takeaways that we haven't talked about, or anything else that you want to address?
Yeah. So, the toxic 5 are a combination of the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, and the nervous system dysfunction that has built up in the body over time. And so this isn't just a one-time exposure sort of thing. Like, we come out of the womb already, as research shows, with over 300 different chemicals found in baby's cord blood. Yeah. So basically in the placenta, through the placenta, we're already coming out of the womb with a lot of these toxins. Yeah. And then, my story was that, I ate a lot of gluten and dairy growing up, and that constipated me. I had a bowel movement like once a week, so I couldn't detoxify. And then those toxins just get recirculated. I was growing up in the 80s. Nobody knew about organic food, so there was a lot of pesticides. There were silver/mercury fillings in my mouth. Eating fish, ate a lot of tuna fish growing up, lots of mercury coming from tuna fish. And it all just kind of accumulated. I lived in places that were moldy. In medical school, I lived in a place where there were cats that peed on cardboard boxes in the basement. Cardboard loves to grow mold. And then I stuck those boxes in my car and drove across country. So I was, really just breathing it in on a daily basis, unfortunately. Then had a couple relationship challenges, then going through residency, so there's all these stressors that kind of built up until, my body called it quits and was like, okay, it's time for you to be napping under the desk every single day now, so that's pretty much the story that we get from people. And there's always a trigger. So people are sometimes okay, once I had that particular exposure or that virus or whatever it was, they think that was the significant trigger. And it was, but that's
Right.
the straw that breaks the camel's back. Like
Mm.
there's plenty of people that can recover from having one sort of little trigger. It's
Mhm.
just what else is happening inside your body. So it's
Hmm.
that total accumulation that needs to be addressed.
Very, very interesting. And yeah, that kind of reminds me of I forget what it's called, but there's that study with stress, or I forget the guy's name, but that came up with where yeah, you kind of reach that level of stress where you kind of reach that tipping point. I
Was it
forget the,
Cellier?
say that
Hans
again.
Cellier? Cellier?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I've never known how to say his name. Yes.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah, and then how does he, if you can recall, how does he describe that? It's the same, it's basically the same what you're saying. It's like an accumulation of stress, right? That
Correct.
you reach a tipping point where your body can't handle, stops being able to
Exactly.
handle it,
Yeah,
essentially.
there's a curve, there's an optimal zone, and you want to kind of fluctuate around that. My wife talks about this a lot too. She's a trauma-informed mindfulness coach with
Oh,
her work.
oh,
And
wonderful.
so yeah, and so there's an optimal zone for you to be in, where when you have these really high stressors, your adrenals are going to produce cortisol, which manages your stress, and then you end up in a state where you're producing cortisol all the time, kind of like we were talking about being in your sympathetic
Yeah,
nervous system state. And
exactly.
then your body kind of gets burned down, and then the cortisol comes down, and then it becomes low, and then you just don't have the energy that you need, that cortisol really provides you, that get up and go in the morning.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, too much stress and chronic inflammation can kind of contribute to that chronic fatigue. There are so many different factors and topics. So I encourage anyone who is dealing with chronic fatigue for any reason to reach out to Dr. Hirsch or to Evan. And Evan, do you want to give that name of that website again one more time so that people
Sure,
just a reminder?
it's my fatigue score. So myfatiguescore.com, and that's all one word.
Okay, myfatiguescore.com. Perfect. And then, Evan, are there any final takeaways or anything that pops into your mind?
Yeah, there's a couple. So one is, hopefully I have hammered home the point today that if you address your toxic five, you will get better.
Mm,
So,
yeah,
whatever you do, go through that process. If you want our help, please reach out, get some support along the way. You are worth it. If you want to learn piano, what do? You get a piano teacher. If you
mm,
have a problem with your car, you go to a mechanic, right? You don't ask your next door neighbor who is an accountant, right? You want to see somebody who's a specialist,
yeah,
right? So, if
exactly.
you've got long COVID, chronic fatigue syndrome, you see me, you see Edie, like that's kind of like where you want to look. And then, certain things that you can do right now, that 4-step process that I talked about in terms of the mindset, just
Yeah.
start with gratitudes. Try,
Mhm.
work on getting into a state of gratitude every day. It can be the same 3 things. That's really what the research is on: 3 gratitudes a day. It can
Mm,
be different 3 gratitudes every single day. But the more you can live in gratitude, where gratitude lives, anxiety and fear cannot live. So
mm. Oh, I
really
love
important to be in gratitude.
I love that. It is really powerful. And I see that across like spiritual practices too, and mentioning gratitude. And I just want to say, for anyone listening, I mean, I appreciate you mentioning me too, Evan. But of course, I really consider myself kind of an educator at this point. But when it comes to the working with a practitioner, I would reach out to Evan, because Evan can actually help with you on that physical level, which is again what I hear so many people saying is that they can't find a practitioner to work with, or even the few practitioners that are out there, a lot of them aren't taking new patients.
Mhm.
They might already have full practices, or again, we seem to have a shortage or not enough people practitioners that really understand this. So again, I encourage anyone who's listening to reach out to Evan and take that quiz and get started, and yeah, and make that intention. And there's so much that can help you. There really is a lot of hope, I believe. So
Oh, and
thank Go
one
ahead.
last thing
Yeah,
is that,
cool.
I do operate online as a health coach. And
Yeah,
so I am able to help people across state and national lines. So if you
awesome.
have internet and you can get supplements online, you
Yeah,
can work with us. And I
awesome.
have created a system where once you sign up and you fill out your intake form, I can get you a plan within 7 days. So you no longer have to wait 3 or 6 months to see me. So
Oh, perfect.
So we can really help people expeditiously.
That's perfect. And Evan, one more time, what is the website for people to get started?
myfatiguescore.com.
Okay. Thank you so much, Evan. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So nice to meet you virtually. And thanks everyone for listening. And I hope that you, everyone that's listening today finds the answers and support that they need. And thank you so much, Evan. I'll talk to you in a little bit. And it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for all of your expertise.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.